Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my name is Danish. Welcome to panel 2 on representative leadership. This panel will explore the vital role of community leadership in ensuring representation not only for intra-community development, but also as a bridge between the state, the Muslim minority community, and the wider social fabric. Before we begin, please allow me to lay out some housekeeping matters. We seek your cooperation to switch your mobile devices to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Tag us using the hashtag ICCOS2024 on social media. We'd love to see your photos and videos. Throughout the session, should you have any questions for our panelists, you may scan the QR code on screen to submit them via Pigeonhole Live. They will be addressed during the Q&A session later. And finally, Chatham House rules apply. Panel attendees are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers nor that of any participant may be revealed. Without further ado, let me introduce the panel chair, Dr. Hannah Al-Haddad. Dr. Al-Haddad is an adjunct faculty member at the National University of Singapore and the Singapore Management University. With extensive experience in arts-based community development and psychology, Dr. Al-Haddad specializes in child and family therapeutic playmaking. Dr. Al-Haddad sits on the board of Beyond Social Services and is a member of the National Crime Prevention Council. She is also on the board of visitors of the Singapore Civil Defence Force and Singapore Police Force. May I now invite Dr. Al-Haddad on stage, accompanied by all panel speakers. Dr. Al-Haddad, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you don't mind, I have to put on my grandma glasses because I can't see. Yes, welcome to... Sorry, I have to do this because it's one of those reading glasses, right? So it helps me read, but if I put it on like this, I can't see any of you. So I have to look at you like this. Okay. Assalamu alaikum again. Welcome to panel 2, representative leadership. I was very heartened and glad when Muiz invited me to chair this panel, because I believe that this is a topic that we need to discuss and talk about more. To have representation in our societies, and especially in leadership, right? Because in authentic, vulnerable leadership, it's when we uplift and bring the voices of especially those who are vulnerable and marginalized up to the forefront. So representative leadership is, I find, very important. This panel consists of Dr. Brodard, Baptiste Brodard, Dr. Harun Al-Habshi, and also Ms. Amina Rasul Bernardo, all very prominent experts in this field. And what we will do today, inshallah, is to discuss the importance of the role of community leadership in working towards the goal of being adequately representative and inclusive, right? Not only within our own intra-community development, but also between, we serve as conduits to provide the platforms to represent and serve those voices that need to be heard between the state and also the Muslim minority community, and between the community and others who are part of the broader social fabric. Our first talk will be by Dr. Baptiste Brodard. He will be talking about leadership in Muslim faith-based organizations and how it aligns with challenges faced by Muslims, FBOs, faith-based organizations in short, and in aligning with Islamic norms, the role of leaders in engaging with broader society to counter negative stereotypes, and collaboration, prioritizing genuine contributions to community welfare, and also giving practical strategies for Muslim leadership that are both representative and legitimate. Then followed by a talk by Dr. Harun, who will be talking about education as a catalyst for socioeconomic mobility in the Malay Muslim community, looking at the socioeconomic progress of our Malay Muslim community in Singapore, and prioritization of collective progress over organizational interests. Then Ms. Amina Rasul Bernardo will be looking at women's leadership in peace building and social cohesion, and empowering change. How women, particularly in conflict-ridden areas, are important and crucial and pivotal in bridging divides and fostering social harmony. And how Muslim women, including alimat, have leveraged their roles to address conflicts and enhance social cohesion within their communities, and should be providing practical approaches to empower women in tackling human rights issues, advocating for reforms, and supporting socioeconomic development. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Baptiste Brodard. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon. I would like to start my speech by expressing my gratitude, my thanks to the Singaporean government first, then to the MUIS, Islamic Council organization, that invited me to speak about this interesting matter. And I want to start also saying that when they proposed the topic about Muslim leadership, I was a bit skeptical, and I will start to explain why. Because from my background, coming from Western European countries, I lived most of my life in Switzerland and in France, it's not common to speak about Muslim leadership. If we speak to Muslims and you ask who are the Muslim leaders, a lot of people will take it as a joke. They will laugh, they will cite names just to have fun. And finally, even some of them will say, there is no leader after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we are just equal. Actually, that's interesting to start with this short example, because it shows that we have to understand the importance of the context before starting to speak about the issue of leadership. The context of European societies, first of all, it's characterized by a strong assimilationist system in which there is no room, no place for multicultural society. Somehow the society is multi-ethnic, but it doesn't accept the diversity of cultural expressions or religious expressions, at least in France and even Switzerland. Lately, as Mr. President said in his very interesting talk in the morning, he spoke about the riots in the UK that happened a few months ago. We're expected to see Muslim responses, and whereas the responses didn't come from the top level, but at the local level, we found very interesting figures that allow us to rethink about these questions of leadership. So on the one hand, we can say we don't have clear Muslim leadership at the top level of society, but at the local level, some people show them as leaders. So I would like to speak about these questions in a very pragmatic way, because the idea or the intention of my talk is to try to identify practical solutions, not just speak about theory. So I'll start by a very short introduction after these few explanations of the context. I have to say that I spoke about the assimilationist system in Europe that characterize some of our society, in which when you speak about community, is not something that is accepted rightly. But concretely, it's a reality by itself because everybody is aware of the Muslim presence. Yet, you have this idea of the state and the society without any community component in some of the social models. That's in theory, because in practice, everybody knows that there are communities based on cultures and based on faith. So, to start with this short introduction, I just have a few points to highlight here. The first point is that although Muslim leadership is not a term we want to use in France or Switzerland, my previous research studies on Islamic charities and Islamic organizations in both Europe and Latin America shows that they are Muslim leaders, even if they refuse to call themselves as such. So we may ask, who are the Muslim leaders? And we may not be able to respond, but in the field, at the grassroots levels, you will identify leaders who show the way to the broader Muslim community. So, although that's a term that may not be used, leadership is something real, and is something that takes place in our society as well. Then we have to understand that in countries where Muslims are a minority, we have to reflect on the interaction between three main components or three main spheres. One is the state, one is the broader society, what we call society in brief, and what is the last one is the Muslim community. The leader must find a place of a mediation between the three sectors. He must be able to speak with Muslims, but also with the state, and he must be a voice also towards the broader society. That's something very important in the context of plural societies, but although we speak about plural societies to characterize both Singapore and European system, for instance, we have also to explain the difference here. On the one hand, Singapore, yes, it's a plural society, but on the other hand, Singapore has a traditional historical Muslim presence, which is not the case in Western European countries. And that's a very important difference to understand the dynamics between the state and the communities. In many European countries, Muslims are still perceived as a foreign group, as an outsider side, not as a real reality. Local presence of Muslims, although it starts to be significant quite a long time ago, is still something challenged by the mainstream view that consider to perceive it as a foreign element that is not welcome most of the time. Conversely, in Singapore or even in Cape Town, South Africa, you have the Muslim community, which is still a minority, but which has a historical presence. And that changes a lot of dynamics between the state and the broader society and the Muslim community. It's something we should never forget. What a Muslim leadership means? It's a very broad question. I just try to summarize in a very few points. First, we speak about religious leadership in the morning, community leadership, and also political leadership. So there are different kinds of leadership, but I would like to focus on the community leadership. The objectives of a leader is obviously to lead Muslims towards the best practices and action, but according to the context. So Islam per se is a corpus of values and principles that has to be understood and interpreted in the light of the context. When doing so, The leader can also build bridges between Muslims and non-Muslims, which fosters social cohesion, and that's one of the major roles of such Muslim leaders. He also has to show a positive image of Muslims and Islam in society in which most people don't really understand what it is, and people remain highly suspicious towards Muslims and Islam. The role of Muslim leader is also to work to transmit a genuine and more appropriate image of what Islam is and who are the Muslims of that country. Lately, also, it implies to be an interlocutor to both the state and civil society, but also to stay close to the Muslim community. That's why, in this regard, is at the crossroads between all these three components. Again, speaking about the context, if we look at the state of Muslim representative leadership in Western European countries today, mostly France, Switzerland, Germany, will fail to cite names of Muslim leaders. If someone will cite names, other Muslims will deny that. They will say, no, they are not our leaders. So there's no consensus to identify who is the Muslim leadership and who are the Muslim leaders in those countries. That's a big problem because the state and even the civil society organizations are looking to the Muslim interlocutor. They expect to identify one sole Muslim voice with whom they can speak about matters regarding Islam and the Muslims. Still, we don't have that still today. Why? Some will argue that there are few people or no people capable of fulfilling this role. That's the first argument. But I would say that the real reason behind that is the doctrinal and ethno-linguistic division between European Muslim communities that hinders the identification of an anonymous Muslim leader or even a few leaders, because we have a lot of different streams, different ideological but also ethnic Muslim groups in which you find many leaders that don't really work together. And at the opposite of the Singapore context, we don't have a sole organization like the Islamic Council who is able to express and to represent the Muslim voice in one country. This diversification of voices has become a high problem today, and it's responsible also of the weakness of the Muslim community that can't really gather or work together to have a significant role in society. The only way I found out, based on my research field, to tackle that issue involves a bottom-up approach to identify natural leaders who can convince the Muslim masses. So it wouldn't be a top-down approach, but the opposite, because the first step that we tried to implement didn't work. Here, speaking about the leadership at the local scale, because we want to go bottom-up, I think the example of the FBOs, faith-based organizations, the Muslim charities working in different projects at the local scale, is interesting to be taken into account because it highlights a concrete role in society, and some of the people behind this activism have become what we can call leaders, and they are Muslims, and they represent Islam, if I can say, much better than people coming from other kind of institutions. And I will try to discuss why is it so in a few seconds, inshallah. These organizations are characterized by an effort coming from scratch, coming from a small group of people who try to act according to the faith in society. So for instance, you have 1, 2, 3 men and women who start a project, then the project grows and becomes an organization having a concrete impact on society. And these organizations always depend on a charismatic figure, which is the illustration of leadership. And I think that's an interesting way to think concretely of this subject of Muslim leadership in the European context. I got very quickly, I got three examples. Two from the UK, one from France, and we'll see the difference. Some of the names may be familiar to some of you. I see some spies in the audience. Obviously, we could also cite other people. The idea is just for illustration purpose. But according to my research, they have the characteristics of the leader, at least at the local level, sometimes even at the national level. The first one is Imam Adam Kerwick, who is the Imam of Abdullah Quriyam Mosque in Liverpool, the UK, is well known both for his activism, is working in the NGO sector, traveling a lot, giving welfare services to many communities worldwide. At the same time, he's an imam and is involved in Muslim scholarship. So he combines both the word of Islam, the discourse, the scholarship, but also the practice. Recently, he was involved in tackling the problem of riots that came from the right-wing, extreme right-wing in the UK a few months ago. And some of you may have heard that in the news. He was in the mosque at one of these evenings of protests, and he went outside with a group of the mosque participants of the Muslim men and women from the mosque. They went outside and they speak straight to the people doing the protest. And they provide them with meals, they try to establish a contact, and in some occasions it led to a de-escalation of the conflict because some of the protesters were touched by this gesture. And when we interviewed the imam and we said, why did you do that? He said, I just try to follow the Prophet Muhammad Sunnah, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, saying that if people attack us, we're supposed to try to understand why, and then to establish people. When ignorant address us, we respond by salam, peace. And this example, among many others, illustrates his positionship in society, in the Muslim community. He always tried to be in the middle between the broader society and the Muslim community. Also, as an interlocutor to the state, he's very active, and I think we don't have time here to go into details, but I think that such people can inspire us of understanding what's the Muslim leadership in Europe. We have also in the UK, not far from Liverpool, in Dewsbury, Imam Farouk Yunus. He himself is an imam of a mosque, but he launched a charity, communal, to help the youngsters of the area to find their way in the society. So these youngsters are Muslims, they are born in the UK, they find issues with racism. Some of them were also involved in violent extremism. The imam launched the charity to prevent the escalation of the conflict between communities. Here again, you have the same kind of approach. On the one hand, he is a scholar, on the other hand, is an activist. He tried to implement the teachings of Islam in the society at the local level with very powerful results. The third example, Imam Ismail in Marseille in France. I cannot say is a counter-example because he conducted similar projects, both trying to work on his scholarship, trying to help the Muslims, and to develop activities with the church, with Christian or other kind of organizations at the local level. He did good, but why I said it is a counter-example? Because of the difference of the context. In that context, this imam himself began to have problem with the authorities. He began to be accused of being too political, to be maybe against the mainstream political orientation of the country. And why I took his example, because on the one hand, I would say it's a good case of Muslim leadership at the local level. On the other hand, we've seen before that it's very important to keep the balance between the three spheres. One is the state, one is the Muslim community, one is the broader society. And in that case, a good balance was made between society and Muslim community, but a lack of communication took place between himself and the statutory agencies, the authorities, which finally led to problems that he is personally facing problems at the time. And it shows that the role of a leader must always seek balance in that difficult time of crisis. It's crucial to find a way to be able to stay connected with the authorities without going too harsh, even if we disagree on some points, but at the same time staying closer to the Muslim community. If we want to identify the roles for Muslim leaders, I would just summarize a few points here. The first one, he has to set an example through one's behavior, to the behavior of himself that must be complying with the discourse. A lot of people teach Islam, a lot of people are involved in theory, even in scholarship, but it's crucial to embody the qualities we want to teach in our concrete life. You must be able to express also relevant and meaningful discourse on Islam. As a leader, we don't expect him to be a scholar, or we don't expect her to be a scholar, but at least it must have some consistency in the discourse that must express through action in society. Very important point. Finally, the idea is to positively influence people through both words and action. That's the difference between a scholar, an intellectual figure, and a leader in society. A leader in society must have a concrete role. If not, he can be perceived as a leader paving the way for further generations. The requirements of that involve a minimum of religious literacy, but also being of high morality standards. Very important point, because we don't want to cite names, but we have had known about many Muslim leaders in Western countries that had personal shortcomings, and when these shortcomings were published in society, they lost any credibility, and that created some struggle for the Muslim community. Some people even lost faith because they thought that these people were leaders to be followed. When they found out what about their private life or shortcomings, they lost faith even in the message. So leadership is a crucial role that must combine both the words and the action. And the most difficult thing is to comply with our discourse, because the Islamic discourse brings very high values that many people may fail to implement in their life. But the duty of the leadership involves to be both a role model, but also a mediator, to keep contact between different parts of the community and the society who don't have the same expectation and who don't have the same levels. We spoke about this mediation position before. I think it's one of the key messages I want to bring in this very short talk. But to identify the challenges and the issues we have talking about leadership in the Muslim communities in Europe, we could find many problems, but I think two are the most important here. The first is a need to bridge the gap between theology and action, or words and practice. It's crucial, and is not the easiest task, but I would say that's the top priority. Before being a leader, one should work on herself, on himself, to be able to embody the message that he or she wants to carry to society. A second very important point is that a leader must have multiple roles, which is not easy to implement. A scholar wouldn't be perceived as a leader most of the time, because he may be just busy with his scholarship and far away from society. An activist without knowledge must also be perceived as someone from the field, but lacking theory, lacking content and scholarship to be viewed as a leader who is able to change society or to bring an added value. So the combination of the multiple roles is very important here. I was asked for this talk to end up talking about my experience of leadership, about my own journey as a European Muslim, doing different kind of works, both in the academia but also in the society. I work, for instance, in the CVE, countering violent extremism, with the French government. I work as a consultant for Islamic organizations in the UK and in the academia in Switzerland for the university. And the main difficulty I think that Muslims in these roles find is that we feel standing between two fires. On the one hand, we are from the Muslim community and we want to keep close to the Muslim community. On the other hand, we took a step forward towards the state, towards society, which involves to have this mediation position. And to navigate between both can be a bit challenging, especially in times of crisis. Now we face this issue of radicalization, as they call it, violent extremism. And if you work in that field, a lot of people from the Muslim community will think that is not our duty. The broader society thinks it's the duty of the Muslims. Even the state have expectations on us. And it's always difficult to navigate between different spheres and trying to keep straight and genuine in line with our own Islamic tradition. But at the same time, we have to open our minds to diversity because we evolve in a context of plural societies. And that's one of the biggest challenges I found. But at the same time, since all this conference is about bringing positive examples, I think the key is not just to focus on problems that we try to resolve, but also on good practices. I quoted a few imams and leaders before to show that there is a way to have a concrete role in society that benefits both the main society and the Muslim community. By concrete action, by thinking about Islam in the light with the context, and by finally bringing added value to all society, both Muslims and non-Muslims, both by talking, teaching what Islam is about. Because most people ignore what Islam brings as a message. Till today in Europe, a lot of people think that Islam is a problem, not a solution. But there's a work and responsibility of Muslim leaders, not just to address Muslim audience, but to address the broader society, to visit Christian organizations or other civil society organizations to try to explain what Islam is about and to be an interlocutor towards the state. Because the state representatives, some of the state representatives are genuinely looking for a voice, for a Muslim voice to address, to try to find solutions when there are specific problems. But because of the lack of unity, they fail to identify this voice. So that's our duty for us to communicate more efficiently about Muslims and Islam to the government, but also to the society. That's one thing. But the other thing is to implement Islam concretely in our life, which starts by being involved in the society at the level of politics, economy, social life. For instance, there are social issues that are the responsibility of Muslims to bring solutions, not just for the Muslims, but for the whole society, as Islam teaches. That's a crucial point, and often action, concrete projects are much more powerful than theory and words and speaks. So, to follow up with these ideas, I would say that taking up the role of a leader involves first to embody the qualities and actions that we want to spread around. It's not possible to teach a message before starting to implement in our life. In the Quran, in Surah Al-Isra, there is a part of a verse in which Allah says, اقرأ كتابك كفى بنفسك اليوم عليك حسيبا. That's the idea Or in English, we can translate that by read your book, the book of your life, your action. Kafa binafsik. It's sufficient for you. And this day, in the day of judgment, this is sufficient. Because if you look back to your life, you can be accountable of ourselves. And I think that's the first quality of a Muslim leader, is to implement that in his own life, her own life. To be able to correct ourselves, because we're all sinners. But the idea is to try to develop ourselves and to level up to improve our level, to improve our life, our moral standards, and then we can teach and practice things according to these values. And that's very powerful by itself. It involves education, but also spiritual development and self-assessment, as I said, which can be translated as muraqaba. Then connecting theory to concrete practice, I think that comes in line with what has been said a bit before, but it's a crucial point because at least in European context, if you look what happened, most of the scholars or most of the thinkers, they don't have any practice in society. Most of the practitioners, they lack scholarship, and few people are able to bring both together. Yet, it's very important to apply concrete knowledge in society. Sometimes you see activist projects that pretend to be Muslim, but they are not in line with Islamic principles or Islamic teachings. And that's very important to use this scholarship in an efficient way in order to take part in social life, to develop projects, to have concrete action in society. Then last point, establish positive relationships at the local, regional, national levels if possible. A leadership position is a mediation position by itself, so it involves to be at the middle between the Muslim community, between the broader society and the state. Like this triangle, the leadership position forces the leaders to always look for balance, which is not an easy exercise, but that's a duty. So I think my time is over. Jazakumullah khair. Thanks for the attendance, and hopefully we have Q&A session a bit later. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brodard. That was a very, very inspiring talk of being a leader. That implies to be a role model and what it takes to be a leader. And being a leader, what voices do you amplify and how do you do that? And how do you uplift and get that voices heard from the ground to the state? Right? Our next talk would be Dr. Harun Al-Habshi. Over to you. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'll just gently correct her in terms of characterizing me as an expert in the field. Really, I'm no Islamic scholar. I'm really just sharing as a practitioner on the ground with regards to the Muslim community locally. I'll be highlighting some very local examples. Why I bring a glass of water here is really so that, just to assuage my nervousness, given that our foreign delegates, actually, there are very many senior community leaders who are representative of the local Muslim community here in the audience today, and I just wish to acknowledge that. Now, in this brief presentation, and I'm mindful of the time we have, I will share my own personal reflections as a young leader of one of the community and charitable organizations for the Muslim community here in Singapore, and that is LBKM, Lembaga Beasiswa Kenangan Maulud, loosely translated in English as Prophet Muhammad's Birthday Memorial and Scholarship Fund Board, where we, in commemoration of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's birthday and his legacy, we raise funds annually to contribute back to the cause of education, primarily through the provision of bursaries and scholarships. So that is through the lens in which I will share with you my presentation today. Broadly, I will cover 5 key areas. The first is in relation to the potential extent of impact of representative leadership. The second will look at the ever-changing landscape of those being represented, and that is the Muslim community. The third is looking at the wide potential and actual scope of representation of such leaders from minority communities. And the fourth, the organizers have also asked that I shine a light briefly about LBKM as an example of organizational representative leadership here in Singapore. And finally, I will close with some insights about a local program, the Tunas at M-Cube Leadership Program, that I've been privileged to journey alongside with other community leaders, some of whom are also in the audience today. So the first is really in terms of the extent of impact. Now, I didn't coordinate this with our keynote speaker's speech, by the way, but my view is that no one person in Singapore is quite as quintessential as the example of Madam Halimah Yacob in terms of representative leadership in Singapore. So she arose from the community and labor movement, and there are well-documented excerpts of her social and financial struggle when in school, and thereafter rising to read law at the National University of Singapore, and before going on to pursue her political career at that point of time. But since 1965, since our inception as an independent country, she has become only the second Muslim and first woman to be Speaker of Parliament, and before later being the second Muslim and first woman to be head of state and president of Singapore. Now, with much respect and endearment, I say this, and for those who have never met the lady, she's quite a petite lady, even shorter in height than I am. She wears her faith on her sleeve. Through the hijab and tudung that she wears, is gentle in her personal disposition, but very much fiercely critical with her words on issues related to community as well as country. Now, the impact she's left on many of us, however, continues to reverberate strongly not only within the Muslim community, but the wider country and global community as well. Now, what's key is that notwithstanding her role and stature in positions that she has been appointed and elected to, she continues to maintain her outward identity and personality with much authenticity and in keeping with her roots, community, and faith. And therefore, the ordinary man or woman on the street, especially the Muslim man or woman on the street, identifies easily with her and what she stands for in a very relatable and genuine way. In Malay, the community would say tumpang gembira, which translates loosely to a desire to feel happy, proud, and also celebrate together in the success and standing of a fellow family member, neighbor, or member of the community. Now, that resonates with the community, and for Madam Halimah, very visibly and identifiably so, continues to be an important part of her impactful legacy to the Muslim community here in Singapore. Now, secondly, through her example of leadership at the pinnacle office of the land, my view is that Madam Halimah has managed to sort of unfasten, undo, and challenge any long-held stereotypes that the majority community may have held towards minorities, and dare I say, even members of the minority who may have held such stereotypes towards themselves. So such is the power of representative leadership from minority communities in shaping and shifting perception of wider society to narrate and believe that even minority communities can contribute beyond the very community they represent. Now, thirdly, and I think this is less studied formally to my knowledge, the impact of Madam Halimah's presidency of tiny red dot sunny cosmopolitan city-state Singapore in shaping perceptions of the global community, from the Middle East to Western powers like US and countries in Europe, as well as China and India. This is not trivial. One wonders, what does that do to shaping the perception and dreams of next generation of Muslims around the world through the example of someone like Madam Halimah Yacob? And how does her standing as President of Singapore pivot the relational perceptions and stereotypes by non-Muslims towards Muslim communities, whether in majority or minority communities? Just to share with you a bit of a story. Now, when I was visiting Morocco some years ago, I visited the Hassan II Mosque, just at the cusp of when Madam Halimah was appointed as President of Singapore. And there was a Muslim tour guide there, taking big groups of visitors, starting to ask the visitors, where are you from? So obviously, I had a very Singaporean look, but he couldn't guess where I was from. I gave him 3 guesses, and after 3 guesses where he took me flatteringly around the world, I said I was from Singapore. And the first words that came out of him was, "Oh, Halima Yaqub," in a very thick Arab accent. Now, this was barely months after her appointment, yet Madam Halima's name had reverberated to the ordinary man on the street of Casablanca. A petite tudung-wearing woman at the apex office of a first world country had seeded impact well beyond this island nation, and I posit that it speaks to the impact of her appointment, her standing, and how others, well beyond Singapore, had taken notice. As far as the impact of representative leadership goes, it is important to note that the legacy of representative leadership goes well beyond the community being represented. Now, the second part which I want to share is really the landscape of the represented. Even as we talk about representative leadership, it is worth noting that we should take heed on who it is we are actually representing and how the Muslim landscape is changing year on year and decade on decade. Now, just to share with you a bit of a data about Singapore, and I imagine the data is different in other countries, but in Muslim minority Singapore, some emerging trends are food for thought. I have always grown up thinking and noting that as far as Muslims go, ballpark, we're looking at a population of 15% of the resident population. If you look at the census of the population in 2020, this holds true at least for those above 35 years old. So you can see the orange bar across the different years from 2010 to 2020 being compared. And you look at it above 35 years old, essentially it's about 15%. But there is an emerging trend of those between 15 to 34 years old that Muslims are holding steady closer to 20% now. And while this is no majority by quite a stretch, it is held on par with other major religions and those who are a-religious in the country. In my mind, this can be both helpful and challenging at the same time. First, how would our previous religious rulings and guidance shift from a minority view to one that is less of a minority, and whether some rulings may be held with less weight now that the minority status or maybe the darurat of a minority holds less true moving forward. Second, how would leaders representative of the Muslim community of the future balance this new tension between community and the state if any new concerns then arise? Will it be less or more difficult to hold previous decisions against the backdrop of a higher proportion of Muslims within the resident population 34 years old and under? The second trend for your awareness is also that 1/4 of Muslim marriages are inter-ethnic in Singapore. So most frequent are the combinations between Malay and Indian couples. Of course, there are other ethnicities as well. And this speaks to the heterogeneity and duplicity and multiplicity of identities, of ethnic identities, that younger Muslims and their children will identify with. Where perhaps there was a greater homogeneity in the local Muslim population for Malay Muslims in the past, over time, and likely by the next census in 2030, this may not necessarily hold true. This then invites a greater intra-community diversity within Muslim communities that need to be considered by representative leaders of the future. And I say this not only in terms of political leadership, but also community and religious leadership as well, where representative leaders not only play a role between the Muslim community and the state, but also in knitting the fabric of intra-community relationships against the backdrop of greater internal heterogeneity and diversity. The third trend, which I have not highlighted in the slide, but I'm sure resonates comfortably with the audience already, is related to the impact of social media. How it informs the landscape of religious practice, religious instruction, and religious identity in the future, how it appears to democratize, rightly or wrongly, access to religious information and knowledge, as well as how it sort of flattens the gradient of religious authority, representation, and leadership going forward. So the third part is really the issue of the scope of representation, and this is where I'll bring back Madam Halima again. When we take the hat of representative leadership in Muslim minorities, there is a certain romanticization that the scope of what the leader can and must contribute towards will be for the community and with the community as the foremost consideration in all decisions the leader has to take. In many aspects, that is true, but really for representative leadership to be at its most effective and valued, I would argue that the leader, him or herself, must be allowed to and able to rise, mature, and lend emphasis to issues that speak to what still continues to resonate with the community, yet has wider scope of representation that extends beyond. Again, taking the example of Madam Halima, her giant standing and profound impact for the community is actually only realized when she engages at tiers of influence scope more widely at the national or global level. For example, before being president, she was also the Speaker of Parliament, and more than representing herself as a Muslim woman in office, she had a strong passion for the vulnerable and less fortunate. She was also advocating for multiple causes, including women, less privileged families, cancer groups, and mental health, among other things. Representative leadership should not be seen as merely pressing forward the foremost issues for the community's benefit alone, but for us at the level of the community to also see our community's contribution to the larger fabric of society, state, or global affairs personified through the work of representative leadership. This then reinforces the virtual cycle of nurturing leaders from the community who are able to represent the community, yet able to balance with some confidence, maturity, and skill the needs of the minority community vis-a-vis the state. The fourth is really representation in community through organizations, and this is where I'll share a bit about my organization, LBKM. I often introduce LBKM as quite a unique organization where it is one of the few non-governmental organizations in Singapore that continues to preserve the construct of institutional membership. In this space, every 2 years, we have elections, and institutional members and individual members can put forward their representatives of themselves to the board of LBKM. You see such institutional representation in the boards of MUIS and Yayasan Mendaki, two of the three arms of MCube that many in the audience are familiar with, but very few organizations from the community sector continue to have this model of representation. I must confess that sometimes, leadership of such an organization has its own challenges for sure, but there are definite strengths from which we glean collective unison and support from the rest of the community organizations. In fact, I would cheekily argue that most of the who's who of community organizations are institutional members of LBKM today, with some like PPIS and MTFA tracking back to our original founding in 1965. The key point to this is the power of a converging and harmonizing force. In the case of LBKM, it is education for community through bursaries and scholarships. The sole mission and purpose of LBKM is community upliftment through education, and in fact, with some of our members and community partners, most recently with PPIS, we supported a co-funded scholarship in their name. This speaks to a willingness and readiness in the leadership of both organizations towards better collaboration to achieve a common good for the wider community without having to reinvent the wheel or making a separate effort altogether. It does take some give and take. It takes some breaking down of barriers and active consensus building to find a middle ground for such an initiative, which ultimately benefits the Muslim community at the end of the day. My view is that this ability and willingness of organizations, including mosques and private sector institutions, and their leaders to collaborate, innovate, and actively find common ground towards consensus building remain key factors in achieving solutions and the best outcomes for contemporary challenges in the community, especially with the limited resources that we may have. Now, the last part is really sharing about Tunas at MQ leadership program, or I tend to call it the leadership collective, because at the end of the program, we really felt like a team relating to the collective good of community. The final area I would cover speaks to this program that some of the leaders of community organizations have had the privilege of attending. It is a program that was curated with the explicit aim to nurture the next generation of Muslim leaders by equipping them with knowledge, with skills and networks to lead the community and their various organizations. It is identified specifically for leaders aged 45 and below. They attend networking sessions, capacity building programs on governance and leadership, and have conversations with government and thought leaders in industry and relevant sectors. You will be able to see in the slides some familiar faces. I will not name them because they're well known, and I'm sure they want to keep a low profile in the crowd. But all of us met at regular and almost fortnightly intervals over a total of 18 months, over several leadership modules with a view towards how to better position our organizations to optimize for community. In this space, we also had frank and open discussions about our own leadership journeys and the ground challenges for community. And more than that, through the leaders ourselves, we built a network and community of trust that I think percolated to our organizations at a level that was not really there before. On reflection, what the program nurtured, most importantly, at least for me, was an emergence of a collective trust, a thought process, and a unity at the leadership level of these community organizations, even as we maintained our own individual and organizational identities and brought our unique selves to the program itself. As a process, this helped me understand better where our priorities overlapped. There were many things that did, and we explored ways to nurture and finesse that towards collective benefit of the community without trying to duplicate and replicate or even outwit one another. We also had access to leaders beyond the Muslim community to hear from them common challenges and concerns they had about Singapore society in general, but also vulnerable and minority communities in particular. This added yet another lens to our worldview as representative leaders of the Muslim community. I personally left with an awareness that where my own community organization, LBKM, sits in the wider community may sometimes be in indirect or indirect tension with some of the goals of other community organizations, and consensus building was really required through the trust building process. Now, where it gets interesting is that even though the Tunas at MCube leadership program focused on individual community organizations for the Muslim community, one could also juxtapose and expand the same outlook in leadership and representation to other layers of representation. And this was not lost on me as I participated in the programs. So, really it's about maintaining the local focus and identity of the respective organizations, but also weighing and optimizing for the greater collective good. Now, the similar consideration and that similar considerations may have had to be held at the same time. For example, in the context of leadership of community vis-a-vis the state, as well as leadership of the state vis-a-vis wider global affairs, especially in finding common ground, deliberating weighted decisions amidst complexity, and achieving compromise, building trust, and establishing reciprocity, even as we attempt to find solutions for collective outcome. In conclusion, I conclude by the following 3 points. Now, the first, at the level of the state, the importance and impact of representative leadership from minority communities can and will go beyond the state community and has far-reaching benefit. The second, at the level of representative leaders, some of whom are here today, heterogeneity in the demographics of the represented community will continue to shift, and community leaders must be sensitive and mindful of this. And at the systems level, leadership lessons and development that you have at the community level are actually scalable and transferable from the organization to wider community, from the community to the state, and from state to global affairs. On the quote that you see there that I have included from Mahatma Gandhi, even if you are a minority of one, the truth is the truth. I think this quote holds true not only for minority of one, but also in the majority. Truth must of course be held based on numerical and quantitative facts, but the data must also be considered in context, especially when it comes to decisions in representative leadership. Often the challenge of leadership decisions, especially in minority communities, lies in the spectrum of context, of ground sentiment and the prevailing environment, and is less so an argument over numbers and data. I hope this brief presentation has been helpful and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harun. I apologize, I forgot to remind the audience to pose your questions to the pigeonhole after every talk. So if you have any questions, please, you can scan the QR code there. And if you have specific questions to the speaker, please indicate that in the question as well, so we know who to direct it to. Yeah, that was a good speech. It reminds me, if I were to sum that up in one word, I would say community leadership moves at the speed of trust, right? And then when you see someone in a place of in a place of leadership that looks like you, like for example when you mentioned, Dr. Halima Yaqub, and I speak for myself, but I don't speak for myself, but a lot of other hijabis, Muslim women in Singapore as well, we looked on her with great pride. We're like, oh, she's our president. We have a hijabi president, especially to my, American friends. And we're like, oh, what do you have? We have a hijabi female president. What about you? It's like, you guys got to get your act together. But yeah, and when we see leaders in positions of power and authority looking like us, it empowers those on the ground as well to speak, because it builds that trust and rapport as well. She looks like me, she knows, and she will listen to the voice. She understands what we are going through, and that sort of empowers and inspires us to share more. We don't feel so invisible, right? So that's the importance of representative leadership as well, right? To have inclusive, diverse leaders in positions of power. With that, I'd like to invite Ms. Amina Rasul Bernardo. She will be talking about the role of community leadership in Muslim Mindanao and a path towards representation and inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hannah. Okay, green, it moves up. Okay, I'm sorry. The technology wizards are my children. I'm Jurassic in my technology. So thank you for bearing with me, and thank you, Dr. Hannah. I'm a practitioner. I'm not a scholar. So to help you out, I'm showing a lot of pictures. Not too many graphs, okay? You have to thank the practitioner for that. I've been asked to talk to you about community leadership as we see it in Muslim Mindanao. Our context is a little different. Yes, we share with you the fact that we are a minority Muslim community. What makes us different is that we have been in areas of armed conflict for over 50 years now. The good thing is we are on the road to peace. We have a successful peace process, and community leaders have had much to do with that. And I'd like to share with you the actual roles that our community leaders have played. So I'll give you a little brief about our situation today, the challenges that we still face, the role of our community leaders, capacity building that we're doing with the community leaders, and give you some recommendations to conclude. Okay, picture start. You know that our peace process has been ongoing since the time of the late President Marcos. And at that point in time, during the martial law years, that's when the armed conflict actually started between the Muslims and government. But realizing it's a no-win situation, government started the peace process. So from the time of Marcos to now, President Marcos, the process, the peace process, is an ongoing thing. And as you can imagine, it's filled with rocks. The path to peace is never smooth. So during the time of the late President Benigno Simeon Aquino, we were able to have the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and government agree on the framework of autonomy. Our rebels were going to stop fighting for independence if we got genuine autonomy, and government and rebels finally agreed framework. But some leaders protested against it, took it to the Supreme Court. rocks along the path to peace. Later on, it was finally signed. Comes President Duterte, we think it's going to be easy to have the agreement because he's from Mindanao. But then we had the Marawi siege. Again, problems, slightly derailed. And there you go. Marawi siege derailed the talks, but not by much, by a year or so, delayed the passage of the bill. But because Duterte is from Mindanao, he was able to have the bill passed in spite of the 5-month attack on Marawi that all of you know. So major barrier on the path to peace. And then agreement passed, law signed. We think the experiment of autonomy is going to start. Then we had the bombing in Marawi, December of last year at the Mindanao State University, when our Catholic friends were having their first Sunday Advent Mass. So what do you do in situations like this? And then now, of course, this is not about armed conflict, but conflict nonetheless. We have an agreement for an autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, 5 provinces, and then Sulu, my home province, filed a case with the Supreme Court a few years ago, saying they did not support the plebiscite. 54% said they don't want to be part of BARM, they don't believe in the plebiscite. They brought the case to the Supreme Court, and wow, democracy won. Democracy exists and it is practiced in Mindanao. But because democracy rules, Sulu, according to the Supreme Court, does not belong to BARM because they voted against BARM. What does that make of the region of autonomy? Major block along the road to peace. But there's nothing we can do. That's the reality of a democracy. So now, in Muslim Mindanao, we have a very, very complex situation. What are some of the challenges that we face? Complex conflict dynamics, because you've got the Moro National Liberation Front, the original rebel group. You have the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. You have violent extremist groups associated with ISIS and Jama'ah Islamiyah. You have traditional politicians' conflict, especially when there are elections. We have elections next year. You have the conflicts that has its roots in the Middle East, extreme right-wing fundamentalist interpretations of Islam, like what do you do with women? Do you allow women to lead corporations, to run for office? We have a lot. It's very, very complex. We have continuing security risks and threats, just like what happened in December last year when we had that bombing in Marawi. We have socio-cultural complexities. Muslim Mindanao is home to a diverse group of nations, indigenous peoples, Bangsamoro groups, among others. And then we have tremendous lack of resources. The Bangsamoro region is not only the most conflict affected, it remains one of the poorest regions. So in this particular case, what do? If we want certainty that there's going to be continuous efforts at strengthening the community, making the communities resilient to the lures of violent extremism, making our communities engaged in democratic processes or engaged in peace building and continuously engaged with national government, you cannot just rely on politicians and rebels. We have to rely on the leadership coming from the communities. And many times this is overlooked at the national level. And who are these community leaders? You and I know who they are. They are your religious leaders, your traditional leaders, in our case here in Southeast Asia, the Sultan. is in many ways a community leader. The datu, the chieftain in the kampong, and of course the women. So, what do we expect them to do? First, we expect them to help strengthen the communities, and they do. They are the voices of the forgotten. And in areas where local governments listen to them, they have stronger cohesion and greater immunity to the lure of extremist thoughts. Let me share with you only one slide graph that I think you're going to find very interesting. Right after the Marawi siege, we did a survey. And this is one of the results of the survey. We asked the communities in Muslim Mindanao, who do you trust? Who's the most trusted? And as you can see, the most trusted are the religious. That's why no matter what we do, we cannot not engage the religious leaders, both men and women. And who is in the top three? Traditional leaders, the datu, the sultan. Civil society is there. Where are the politicians? All the way in the bottom. So I don't understand it. They may get the vote because they win, but when you ask communities who they trust, they're always at the bottom. Go figure. So what needs to be done? We need to empower those who have influence. And in our case, we started working with the ulama in 2006, 2007, and we helped them organize a national network. And why was that important? We learned from the lesson of Muhammadiyah, Nadlatul Ulama, and here in Singapore, the case of Muis. When the religious leaders are together, the voice is amplified, government listens. In my country, the ulama, the religious leaders, are not really united, so there is no amplification of their voice. This needs to be done. As for the women, most of our madrasas, the teachers are women. So we needed to go and reach them and help them similarly organize their own network, and they have their own, they call it Nurus Salam. Now, what other roles do the community leaders do in the Philippines, and especially in the South? They bridge the communities with the state. As I said earlier, it has always been that the voices heard by government were either politicians or rebels. We need to bring in another group. And here, interlocutors who come from the communities, from civil society, are very effective in changing the perspective of government about what the problem is and what needs to be done. So we, as civil society, we have tried to also be part of the group that becomes an interlocutor, and we try to bridge our leaders, our communities, with the national. Where there is a gap, we try to come in and fill the gap. And in this particular case, we realized that the leaders of industry, of business at the national level, do not know our people. If they do not know the leadership of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, do you think they will support the peace process? No, they won't. So we made it our obligation to bring the leadership of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front to talk to the leaders of Makati, the top leaders of our industry and economy. And in this particular picture, that is the chair of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Murad Ibrahim, and beside him is a former finance minister and former prime minister of the Philippines, Cesar Virata. This can only be done by leaders who are associated with the communities. So bridging communities and state, interfaith dialogue and unity. Because we are Muslim minority and because we've had decades of conflict with state, we need to make sure that we strengthen the foundation for unity, as you do in Singapore and you do elsewhere. The problem is we have been fighting. So we need to find documentation from within our faith and from the peoples of the book that say it is our obligation to know the other and to work with the other. And we have found one such document. It's called A Common Word, written by Muslim scholars. And we need to get documentation like this, popularize it, have our community leaders be the ones to talk about it, because it tells us that we are commanded by God to love our neighbor. First commandment is to love God, and then we love our neighbor. Why can't we have more documentation like this that can help us bring our communities together? Education. We in the Muslim Mindanao region, we have the highest case of illiteracy. Over a third of adults are illiterate. National government is failing in reaching out to adults because they're focused on children. A gap like that is where community leaders again step in. They do non-formal education. At the madrasa level, they can teach the mothers and the fathers to read and write. They do that in Arabic. Why can't they do it in English script, which has a lot of positive implications if you're looking for a job or if you're teaching your child to do better in school? So, what is the role in pushing for education? As I noted earlier, the women, most of the teachers in the madrasas are women, in the Philippines anyway. Why can we not work with the women who teach in the madrasas to teach parents, children, not just reading and writing, but other subject matters as well, all to strengthen communities? And so we have started working with women, and we have started developing modules for them. And two of them is Islamic peace education, and we have worked with one of the MUIS leaders here, with my brother Hanan, on Islamic peace education. And we've been also working with the Commission on Human Rights to look at human rights, but with the lens of Islam. And this is our latest initiative, all to empower community leaders, particularly women. We have been working with the Mindanao State University to develop a diploma program, only 3 semesters work, on women, peace, and security. This will now help us better implement the national action plans on women, peace, and security that's supposed to be passed, really, by all members of the United Nations. It's growing. The number of countries, of governments who have national action plans are growing. This year is the 24th anniversary of the WPS agenda. Next year is the 25th. My government is hosting an international conference on women, peace, and security, October 28 to 30. All of this because it realizes women are a key partner if we are to have resilient communities, peaceful communities, if we are to have progressive communities. So I do hope that some of you can join us when we have the conference on WPS later this year. We also look for, okay, this is now the non-Jurassic part of me. We have a podcast, which we started because of COVID. We couldn't go out, so we needed to continue teaching. And my son said, "Mom, why don't you do a podcast?" And I said, "Great idea. What's a podcast?" So we did it, and it works. Because you're not doing anything, you're in a car, you're washing your clothes, and the audio comes on, and we interview people from Yemen, Palestine, Singapore, Myanmar, and they tell you about the work that we're doing in peace building, the situation that's happening in Gaza, in Ukraine. And we are reaching out to a bigger group who have never had this kind of experience shared with them before. So we think we have to start looking for non-traditional ways of reaching out and sharing our experiences, because we need to find every way possible that we can, so that we empower our community leaders, and in this case the women, so that they can truly help us make our communities resilient, cohesive, functional, progressive. So my dear colleagues, the success of our peace process in Mindanao, in BARM, our transition towards peace and autonomy, doesn't just hinge on the passage of a piece of paper called a law for BARM. It doesn't just hinge on the fact that the President Marcos, is supportive. It really does hinge on the existence and the continued support of community leaders. And let me tell you why. Because if a bomb is going to explode, it's not Bongbong Marcos's home that's going to be affected. It's my neighbor. So it became really important for us to continue that impetus, to continue that initiative, continues to strengthen leadership from within our communities, and do not just rely on outside forces, whether they're the president or the regional governor, to do the work for us. And with that, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Amina. That was a moving speech and talk. That reminds me as well, if I were to share a personal anecdote about representative leadership in the madrasa in Singapore. A few weeks ago, I take my 3 children to madrasa. We live far in the east, and then the madrasa is somewhere in near this center. And so I send them, and then I wait in the school while they are having their classes, right? And so I hear what they're learning and all that. And one of the sessions was about, and this was in a classroom with kids around 10 to 11 years old. And the teacher asked, what makes you a good Muslim? It's a very simple question, right? And so one of them said, yes, we have to, keep to our 5 pillars, pray, don't miss your salat and all that. And then the conversation, and this was me like listening outside, and the conversation moved into, we have to be better Muslim to represent and support our brothers and sisters, not just ourselves, not just us, doing what we can do to be a better Muslim, but to support our brothers and sisters, not just in Singapore and outside. And the conversation took a different level, and I thought this was it. I was impressed by the way the conversation did. And what they were talking about was, they said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this universe and this earth, and yet we are destroying it. All right, and so they were talking about climate change, and they were going, what can we do to be better Muslims, to take better care of our earth and our universe? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this beautiful earth, and then we are just destroying it. And then another one said, yeah, and there's war crimes and genocide happening, and what are we doing? We're just watching and scrolling our social media and not doing it. What can we do to create that change? And so the teacher said, okay, let's then she said with them, let them process, because it got quite emotional, that session, and there were tears dropping, because some of the children, it was a highly emotional session. And so she sat with them and processed their thoughts, their feelings, and there's 3 beautiful poster boards to then represent how they can be a better Muslim. And the next week where the class is, the madrasa invited the parents and other teachers to come and see the exhibition that the children have made. And that, to me, was also a beautiful example of representative leadership as well, of uplifting the voices of young children on how they can do better in the world, right? And that as well it empowers them to want to do more, the children. That said, I'm not supposed to give my own talk today. I'm supposed to chair the panel. Sorry, I digress. I do that quite a lot. ADHD brain. Yes, so now I invite you to, again, if you have, we are now in our, sorry, ADHD brain. I'm supposed to give my reflection to the key themes that were brought in the three talks today. One was the role of youth leadership in Muslim communities, right? And it's pivotal in shaping the future of Muslim communities. Dr. Brodard emphasized the need for representative and inclusive leadership that engages the youth actively. With the initiatives discussed by Dr. Said Harun Al-Habshi about showcasing youth collaboration across the sectors for community upliftment, and with Ms. Amina talking about the role of really collecting the authentic voices, right, and giving that platform to showcase their voices. The second theme that we gather was the significance of interfaith advocacy to foster social harmony, and also about how do we make, what's the word? I've lost the word, my brain. How do we make justice to the voices that we want to represent and to the people that we want to represent, right? We can hear the voices from the ground, from the communities, but what makes it to the top people, for example, right? How do we navigate that representation between the ground and the state and the organizations in between? The next one is to engaging in broader society to counter negative stereotypes as well. What can we do? So leaders play an important role in countering negative stereotypes, in standing up and speaking for the broader Malay Muslim or the broader Muslim communities, right? To counter these negative stereotypes. Because a lot of the times when we hear voices, the loudest voices may not be the right ones, right? So how do we disrupt that noise to bring forth the positive message that we want to put forward, right? How do we disrupt that negative stereotypes? What participation in public discourse do we need? And what are the community service challenges that we have? The misconceptions that the broader society has on the Muslim community, and how do we repair, restore, and build that resilience in our positive messaging. So to conclude, I would say let us here to conclude this. After this is a Q&A, right? So we're not concluding this session yet. So for now, I would like to invite those from the floor to ask any questions that you may have. If you have any specific questions to the specific speakers, let us know. I would like to ask questions. I would like to open the questions to the floor first before we go on to the pigeonhole questions. There are a lot of interesting questions that you can see on the pigeonhole. And if you may look at it as well, you can vote on the ones that you want most to be answered, because there are a lot of questions there. So if you can, I urge you to vote those questions that you would like us to cover in the panel. That would be great. But for now, I open it up to the floor. Thank you. Hello. Yes. Do we have our first question from the floor? We have our roving mics around. If anyone if anyone has a question, pardon. You're very shy. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. Nazat Fahima from Singapore. Mainly to Dr. Brodard, I think in the context of Europe, where the circular values are obviously held higher than one's individuality, what do you think are the compromises and negotiations that Muslim leadership needs to have to represent the masses. And in some of the recent years, one of the main issues is the question of whether or not the values of the Muslim community can be reconciled with the democracies. So in that case, what negotiation and compromises do we need to do in the European Western context?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks for the very interesting, relevant question. Actually, that's one of the key problem issue that we have to think on. First, I would say that the task of a leader is to move forward to the broader society from the Muslim community. So it's a step a bit outside, which doesn't mean to abandon these Islamic principles, but which means to try to understand both sides, both worryings, both expectations, and so. And the risk of this very difficult balance to find is that such a person must be perceived from the Muslim community as somehow a traitor, somebody who turns his, who like goes aside from Islam to please the mainstream society and the state. But at the same time, from the other perspective, from the state and from civil society, he may still be perceived as a Muslim who defends the sole interest from the Muslim community. So it's a very different task because he's trying to, or she is trying to find a balance between expectations that can be opposite. The way to deal with that, I would say, is to first genuinely understand what Islam teaches as principles and to differentiate between principles, core values, and secondary norms or even cultural features. Sometimes it's not very clear. But that's a work to be done by itself, because if Islamic principles and higher values are understood, then it's easier to deal with the broader society expectation. As I would assume there's no contradiction to being a Muslim in the West, but this simple idea is not accepted by the mainstream. That being said, of course there's a risk to be too far one side or too far to the other side, and it's always a game of trying to understand both sides without losing principles, but at the same time being able to communicate, to get outside of the comfort zone. Because the comfort zone is to say we know what it is, we don't have to understand the other side's perspective. So I think it's a matter of humility and integrity. Humility because we have to listen to each side's expectations. Maybe they're afraid of Muslims for good reasons. Maybe there are issues in the community that have to be solved. But at the same time, it's very important to keep integrity because it's very easy to fall in political games trying to please to the majority, for instance, of to political parties or to whatever organization that wants to incorporate us and to be perceived by the Muslim community as somebody who is an outsider. So I wouldn't give a very precise answer because I think that's according to the context is very different. First thing is the law. Of course, Muslim communities accept the law in the countries they live. But now the law is evolving in a direction in which there are a lot of new challenges. When talking about LGBT rights and so, a lot of Muslims, they find a lot of difficulty to speak loudly about these issues in terms of Muslim tradition, but at the same time to be accepted by the mainstream society or by the state. But it's very important to acknowledge Islamic principles and these questions, to understand what they are, and to be able to teach them. Then as long as it's not against the law, Muslims in Europe are citizens. They have the right to keep their value, to keep their principles, and to share them. If it's not a lawful problem, I would say it's very important to keep straight. It doesn't mean that Muslims impose their values on others. No, it means that they just want to protect their legacy, their way, and living in peace and harmony with the other, even if every side must have different conceptions of these questions. And this requires integrity, this requires a lot of communication to avoid misunderstanding, because in times of crisis, a lot of sides, even in some Muslim organizations, but also non-Muslim organizations, they are waiting for an error to be made. They are waiting for a problem, for something wrong to be said in order to attack the person, because the context of crisis is very particular. It doesn't help these kind of issues, and now I think in Western European countries we can speak about context of crisis, talking about Islam. And that requires a lot of effort in a clear communication, integrity, but also humility to be able to listen in other points of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel would like to address this question? I think as well, with one, it's a very, like you said, right, it's a very difficult, there's no easy answer to this, because you are managing maybe sometimes opposing views. And also I'm wondering, like we're talking about representative leadership, does it have to be one person? Does the leadership mean one? A representative leader, or leadership could be a collective, right? So is that one possible solution that we could look at, where it's, especially when you want to marry the state, community voices, and religious perspective, to have representatives from those various collectively as a leader, a form of collective leadership, right, to represent. Perhaps then there'll be less like victim blaming, or you know, you are supposed to do this, you are not listening to us, because you see a lot of people in positions of leadership where they go, oh no, you're not listening to us, you're a traitor, da, da, da. But you know, what can we do? Just one other thought that I have. Yes, do we have another question from the floor? Like to open up? Yes. This one in front here. Thank you. The mic, first floor. Oh, behind the rostrum as well? Sorry, I can't see. This gentleman and then...
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My question is for Ms. Amina. So Ms. Amina, I saw the interesting graph you showed, that imams and alims were the most trusted, right? My friend here is an imam and I trust my life with him as well. You know, I was there at ground zero in 2019 in Marawi. I saw what it was like. It was really bad. But I was also very glad to hear the developments thus far, right? But the unfortunate incident of 2023 December, what roles did the imams play in trying to recover from such an incident? You know, after all the hard work that has been done to bring peace again, what were their roles in peace building, and what do you think are the important qualities needed? Of course, we don't wish for any of that happening here, for example, or other countries. But if it were to happen, where should our investments be when it comes to religious institutions, religious leadership, regardless Muslim or otherwise?
The good thing about our experience in Mindanao, initially when the fighting started between the Muslim rebels against government, even the religious took part and became drivers for conflict, really dividing the Christians and the Muslims. But when it became very clear that you could kill thousands, and in the span of like, I think 5 years, 50,000 Mindanaoans were killed in the 70s. When the religious realized it wasn't working, the religious, both Christian and Muslim, took that difficult step of coming together. And they've been doing that steadily over the last 3 decades. The cementing of the peace process, the peace agreement, is also in large part due to the collaboration between the religious leaders, which is why the trust level is incredibly high. That slide I showed you, that's not the first survey that we did, but the second. The first survey we did was way earlier, 2005, 2006 maybe, same results, same ranking. The religious are on top, male or female, traditional leaders, civil society, and then elected. The problem that we see, since our faith is not hierarchical, it's not like the Catholic Church. You talk to one, it goes down. We are divided, but here you have MUIS that brings people together. Indonesia, you've got Muhammadiyah, you have Nadlatul Ulama. In the Philippines, we don't really have that. So there is an imbalance of power between the other faiths and the Muslim faith leaders, and therefore an imbalance of reach. So if we are going to continue addressing the problems in Muslim communities, you have to change that imbalance, and you can only do that by continuous capacity building for religious leaders. So please expect a lot of applications from Muslim ulama when you have the Singapore College for Islamic Studies.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think, we said that, and then after that, we'll,
Okay.
a quick question.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Adib Abdul Somad from Indonesia, from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and my question goes to Harun, Dr. Harun, and also Baptiste. From Mr. Baptiste, you mentioned earlier that one of the difficulties that in Europe cases, so there are so many leaders that cannot work together, and lack of communication, lack of unity, things like that. And for me, I draw the line that the problems for Muslims, if we refer to the Holy Quran, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, it mentioned ka, the huruf, what is ka, means us. Us as a Muslim is actually the ambassador for promoting Islam Rahmatul Alamin. So for me, I guess the most important things that we have to do is not only collective leadership, but also individual. Us as a Muslim, be the best as you can be, just Halimah as a president of the Singapore, and become the reference. So for me, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me, representative leadership is actually, we are going to say every single of us is actually the ambassador for promoting Islam as our beloved religions, as a peaceful religion, and that can be seen through us. The values of Islamic teaching and learning can be seen through the application every single of Muslim. And that's only my comment. Thanks. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Did you want to?
I actually don't disagree at all. I think you're right? That Muslim leaders or representative leaders from the Muslim community need to see themselves as, first of all, torchbearers of the community, bringing the views and concerns of the community forward, and especially in Muslim minorities, bringing it to a stage where it receives attention as well as intervention where there's a need, to be able to support the community's needs. But beyond that, you spoke to the role of Muslim leaders or leaders emerging from the community, being able to da'wah and bring forward the principles that Islam has, the solution that Islam has to wider societal needs. And in that sense, I see it as really in alignment with who we are as individuals, as our Muslim identities, and in our religious faith and traditions, we have the solutions to be able to support, whether in communities of minorities or even majority. I think it takes two hands to clap, in the sense that, of course, the political structure and presence on the other side, where it's receiving the representative leadership from the Muslim community, must also have the alignment with regards to principles and values in keeping with wanting the best for society at large, and I think when these two meet with a view towards wanting the best for the people they represent and the society where whether it's a minority or majority Muslim community, then that's where it becomes very much aligned, and that's where really the identity of the Muslim faith, the religious traditions, actually, rather than being restricted, actually it flourishes, because it's very much in alignment with the greater good and collective good of community as well as society. So yeah, I resonate very much with what you've shared. Thank you.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thanks for the comment and question. It makes sense. Actually, also, I totally agree with what you said. I think that's the Islamic idea of leadership by itself. It's about accountability first, because every Muslim is the leader of himself or herself, because we have the responsibility of our life. Like the Quranic verse says, "Iqra kitabak kafa binafsik." It shows by itself, such as other verses or other hadith, that the Muslim is responsible of all deeds, all the life. And that's the first very strong idea of leadership. The second idea of leadership in Islam, I would say that leadership is not something we want. The believers, al-mu'minun, they never look for leadership position because it's too much burden, too much responsibility. Leadership in Islam is something that the community put on you because of your aptitudes, because of your skills. But when we believe, we don't like that. It's like it's a duty. When people push us, okay, we accept. But it's not something that we look for in the Islamic tradition. And I think in that way, we can understand that leadership is something that can be open to all Muslims, and then it depends of the way of life we try to follow. And it goes in line with the fact also you said that every individual as Muslims are representatives of the faith, of the traditions. They are ambassadors, and people, especially in the context of plural societies or minority Muslim societies, such as in Europe, people look at Muslims and they get the idea of what Islam is, not according to what they say, but according to what they do. So the life of Muslims in those countries are very powerful in the good or bad sense, because if they commit good, they convey a good image of Islam. If they commit bad, they convey a bad image of Islam. But I totally agree with your comments. Jazakum Allah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, it's a quick one, and then we'll go to the pigeonhole questions.
When I was listening to your interventions, I couldn't really help but think about leadership the way that we know it in ASEAN. When I was young, I always think that ASEAN was too slow because they never move unless it's by consensus. And then getting older, I realized that's a very Islamic process. Everything has to be by consensus. And so the leadership, as I have seen it exhibited within ASEAN, may be slow, but when it moves steadily. And when it is by consensus, the leadership gets everybody to support it, there is no backtracking. And I realize that's the difference between our style of leadership as, say, the Western style of leadership, one person, one vote, which can be divisive, as we witness in the United States. There, the leadership is one man. It doesn't matter if 50% of his people don't believe him, but because he's got 50% in support of him, he's the leader, whatever he says goes. That cannot happen here in ASEAN because it has to be by consensus. And for me, that's a very striking difference between leadership based on Islam and other forms.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to move to segue to one of the highest voted question on the pigeonhole is how can we, as Muslim minority, ensure that our leadership is not dependent on charismatic individuals, but rather built on sustainable systems and institutions? Who would like to have a go at this question? Yeah, very good question. Yeah, it segues, it flows from your need the need for consensus. Right? Do you wanna take Ms. Amina?
In a way that reflects my realization about leadership here in Southeast Asia. If it is by consensus, it doesn't matter if the leader is charismatic. The other leaders who also have a lot to protect can bring him down to the same level. That way, no one gets unfair advantage over the others. We stick it together, we move together, or we just stop there together. So consensus.
Actually, I'd like to, maybe, I wouldn't say even as a Muslim minority, how can we ensure that our leadership is not dependent on charismatic individuals, right? It's not particularly unique to Muslim minorities, Muslim majorities, leaders in any other organizations as well. And I think before we choose our leaders, before we allow people to step forward into leadership, it's important that we have an acute sense of where they're from, what their standing is, how they feel about certain matters and issues, and what they represent. And perhaps, as a frame, you can look towards where their previous experiences were, as well as what they've done before. It's the same like how we engage in today's world with regards to religious instruction as well. So if you look at, many people have an opinion with regards to religion, right? They may go to social media and maybe have a following, but charisma and popularity may not necessarily sit well, and it shouldn't, with what is the right opinion and where the weightage is. It is very much within our religious traditions as well, right? Where you lean towards a particular view must also necessarily have the appropriate evidence based on our Quran and Sunnah and so on. So I don't think it's anything, it's not rocket science. It's just that sometimes in today's day and age, it may be a bit more difficult to be able to distinguish between where it's more charisma, popularity, vis-a-vis really weighted knowledge, wisdom, and experience. So I think all of us play a part in that.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with the idea of consensus. I think it's one important aspect of the question. But that being said, I would say there is no strong oppositions between the fact that we need charismatic people, individuals, but also institutions, because both play a role, and institutions are made of people. And I think Islam is a religion of the middle way, balance. We don't want to be fully egalitarian. We don't want to be fully elitist neither. And most ideological systems we could find worldwide, they tend to be a bit extreme in one side or to the other side. In some systems, speaking about France, that's why they refuse the idea of leadership. I mean in the ideology, in the culture, the popular culture, the masses. Because why? Because in such a society, the idea is that everybody is equal, or everybody has to be equal, which is not a fact in society, but that's the ideology behind. This idea makes very suspect every person who tries to improve or to be somebody a bit better than the average. And I think in Islam that's a dangerous idea, because Islam is a religion for improvement, not even a religion. I would say Islam is a deen, a way of life for improvement, in which everybody has to struggle to go higher in terms of morals. And that creates hierarchy in society. But the other extreme is to think that the hierarchy is about power. Islam is about community, and hierarchy doesn't mean that one is better in the eyes of Allah, so because the best of us is atqana, or atqakum, the best of you is the one with most hatefulness, or taqwa, and only Allah knows who is the best. But this idea of very egalitarian society, I think a shortcoming of that, it makes the society going down, and it drives to crisis, or even civilization crisis. So I would argue that, on the one hand, it's good to still have charismatic individuals that can be role models, and they are trying to push things forward to inspire people, to show that we have to develop ourselves. But these people, they should remain accessible and not being seen as another type of people. Instead, they must be seen as examples to be followed. And I think in traditions of Islam, in history, we have plenty of examples. But to mitigate the risk of them being too elitist, the idea of building strong institutions is also a key. So I think both process goes hand in hand. On one hand, we need institutions based on consensus, based on common struggle to push the group in a better state. But at the same time, we have to understand that people are specialized. Some individuals may be better at specific tasks, so they get a more important position in society, leadership. Doesn't mean that they are better than others, but they show the way. And it's about finding, again, a good balance between these two ideas. I would say that. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you, speakers on the panel. I'd like to thank the audience as well. I am very sorry we are fast running out of time. I would have liked to go through more of the questions on the pigeonhole, but unfortunately we don't have enough time. Yes, if I may conclude for real, there's no more Q&A after this. It's representation matters. Islam is a way of life. It values community, right? And as we're saying, it's a way of life, and each and every one of us is an ambassador for leadership as well. But in that, and that's why consensus is built for representative leadership. But in that as well, like what Dr. Brodard said and Dr. Harun and Samina said as well, we need to have organized, the collective has to be organized so that the voices can be amplified adequately. If not, even though there is a collective, it might be scattered and it doesn't get to that point where the voices are heard, right? And it gets dissipated. So with that collective as well, to ensure that different diverse voices are heard and seen and understood to be represented in the leadership, we need to have an organized within institutions, within the imams, the ulamas, and so on, to then be able to do justice in representing the diverse voices together in that collective leadership. With that, I thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.